Hello, everyone. We're very glad to have Dr. Shirin Vossoughi with us today, and she will talk about her recent JLS article, Embodied Pathways and Ethical Trails, Studying Learning in and Through Relational Histories. Welcome, Shirin. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Shirin Vossoughi, and I'm an assistant professor at Northwestern University in the School of Education and Social Policy. And I've been working in education and in educational research for some time, so I'm glad to be here.
Can you describe what led you to the questions and phenomena described in this study?
Sure. So I've been thinking about the development of social relationships as a goal of learning, not only as the conditions for learning for a long time. So Vygotsky has this kind of famous line about how human learning is a social process through which children grow into the intellectual life of those around them. And I think I'm resonating with that and asking about how children also grow into the relational life around them. And so that's been a longstanding interest. Another history of this paper in particular is some collaborative research that I did with Meg Escude in the Bay Area, who was working at the Exploratorium. We were working there together and also working in the Boys and Girls Clubs in the Bay Area to do this after school tinkering and making work. And through that work, which was really a collaborative kind of design and research project, we started to notice the salience of embodied forms of assistance, of the roles of hands and eyes and bodies in the kinds of assistance that were offered and the kinds of experiences that students had, whether positive or negative within the learning environment. And so we started to notice how, for example, teachers would use their hands and words to offer students the feel of working with a new tool, or students might shift their bodies so that a peer could better observe how they were approaching a task, or sometimes block others from seeing what they were doing. We also noticed how educators would sometimes encourage newer members of the staff to notice how kids were working with their hands before intervening to offer support. So there was all of these rich ways that assistance was being offered or help was being offered through the use of the body. So that's another piece of the history of this article. And in this article in particular, we started to think about relational histories and how the history of the interactions actually play a role in the way that the setting develops over time.
Thank you. It's really nice to know about the history and the ideas. So, what are the key questions and findings of the study?
Yeah, so we started to ask about not only particular moments of embodied assistance and how they may convey assumptions about students' intelligence or competence, which was the history of work that we had done up until this point, but we actually started to look at the history of interactions and the relational histories within which they emerged, and started to ask about how students were supporting one another and how the ways that they were supporting one another carried traces of prior moments of assistance that they had received, sometimes from adult educators, sometimes from youth educators. And so there was kind of this particular moment that opened this up for us, which was myself working with a 6-year-old child named Stephanie who was trying to unscrew a screw. And I was kind of bringing in my hands to help her with the screwdriver to help her learn how to unscrew. And I noticed that every time my hands came in, her hands pulled away, which was a phenomena that we noticed, especially for students who were new to the setting or early in their experience, which signals, kind of typical, educator-student interactions and the locus of power. Like, you're going to show me how to do this rather than we're going to do it together. And we were trying to encourage this kind of joint activity and doing things together. So the second or third time that her hands pulled away, I told her, hey, put your hand back on my hand so you can feel the screwdriver. And she did that. And then she started to kind of get the hang of the feel of the tool. And a week later, we were at this pinball museum on a field trip studying pinball machines because the kids were going to make their own pinball machines. And I was working with Stephanie again, and I pulled the launcher on the pinball machine to show her how to launch the pinball. And without prompting, she brought her hand in and put it on top of my hand. And so it was this kind of aha moment that these moments of joint activity and these moments of meaningful assistance actually have histories in prior interactions and take shape within relationships that have a history. And so that really opened things up for us, and we started to look closely at different trajectories of these relational histories over time. In the article, we look at this across three time scales. So we have three cases. The first is actually a 5-minute interaction between two children and Meg, the educator, and the assistance that one child received in learning how to use the hot glue gun, she immediately then used to support her friend within that 5-minute interaction. So that was another kind of opening for us to notice how these forms of assistance actually travel through an interaction and how that can be traced empirically. And the second case spans about a week and looks at two children who were working together on a marble machine and having some difficulty coordinating their interaction and having some moments of conflict. And then the educator intervened to support them, and we noticed that the next week, when they arrived at similar kinds of moments of conflict, they actually utilized some of those resources in order to reorganize their interaction and engage in what we came to describe as a we. Instead of two I's engaging in the same space, they actually formed a we, and we argue that they came to inhabit a kind of shared conceptual world, and that process had to do with these very specific forms of embodied interaction that emerged through the mediation of the educator. The last and final case actually looks at embodied pathways, what we're calling embodied pathways, across 3 years. And we look closely at how one particular 6-year-old child named Tanya received particular forms of assistance during her first year in the program, and then came to utilize those forms of assistance over time within that first year, but also how over the course of 3 years, she came to really take on an expert role within the space and became a very adept and capable peer facilitator. And when we look at her interactions in her third year supporting younger children, we see some of the very sophisticated and kind of thoughtful and intentional movements of seasoned educators within the space. And we really started to see how children were attuning to the kinds of assistance that were routine within the space, and also engaging in a kind of ethical perception, noticing the ethical valence of those forms of assistance and relationality, and then taking those up to support other children within the setting.
It's really nice to see how you actually develop these cases. So how would you describe your methodological approach and any innovations you developed there?
Yeah, so I was lucky to work with a wonderful team of graduate and undergraduate students, as well as Meg Escudé, who I mentioned. So Ava Jackson, Wendy Roldan, Suzanne Chen were students that we were working with. And I mentioned that in part to say that part of our methodology was actually that each of us took on a student to look at very closely over time. And so our research meetings in our lab would involve coming back together after, a week or 2 weeks and sharing with each other what we found about that particular student's trajectory. And so each member of our team became very knowledgeable about the particular embodied interactions and forms of assistance that each individual child was a part of over time. In addition to that, we started to look at how do you kind of trace these pathways, right? And by pathways, we mean if you have an experience of a moment of assistance, what happens after that? How does that moment of assistance potentially become salient beyond that moment? Is it something that you use to support other people? Which involved a lot of kind of genetic analysis, looking forward from beginnings. And one of the things we talk about in this paper is the importance of beginnings and the first few kinds of movements that happen within an interaction. And we also looked backwards from key moments, like, wow, this is a really cool moment of this child helping another child. Like, how did that come to be? What is the history of that interaction within that setting? And we call that kind of being historians of learning. And through these approaches, we began to see, again, how these embodied movements traveled through an interaction. The other methodological aspects of the work involved trying to understand how students themselves were reading these forms of embodied assistance in the moment and paying attention to how they were interpreting what kinds of assistance they were being offered and what they did with that. And we also tried to pair what is common within interaction analysis, which is to look closely at particular kind of hotspots within the data and do that deep dive interaction analysis, with, especially in our third case, looking over a long stretch of time, in this case 3 years, to try to understand a particular student's development as a facilitator and a peer educator over time by doing interaction analysis of many moments within her trajectory. And the last thing I'll say about methodology is that we wanted to figure out a way to render these interactions artistically. So we worked with Walter Kitundu, who's an artist who also taught in the Tinkering After School program where we did our work, to take some of these images and create like artistic portraits out of them in ways that help to anonymize the children, but also that bring forward the kind of aesthetic dimensions of the experiences themselves. And we feel like this poetic sensibility of our learning interactions is really important to trying to understand the role of ethics in learning.
So what do you see as the deeper significance or implication of the work for researchers as well as for the educators?
Yeah, so one of the big ideas that I think is important here is this historical look at moments of embodied learning and embodied assistance. I have learned so much from the work on embodied cognition within our field, and I also think that we could do more to situate our analysis of particular moments in longer histories in ways that would help us understand the significance of the particular ways people engage in embodied interaction in the moment. So I think that historical look is a really important theoretical and methodological implication. I also think that we're contributing to a history of work that understands young children in particular as paying keen attention to the interactions of those around them, and we're contributing to that by really trying to think about their ethical interpretations and the ethical deliberations that they engage in when they make decisions about how to help each other within learning environments. And we also think that there are some important pedagogical implications for teachers. So I myself have experienced this as well as an educator and as a parent, which is that our help that we offer, our guidance that we offer in the moment, can have a kind of double meaning or multiple layers of meaning. And one of those layers of meaning is that it's help to support a student in the moment. Another layer of meaning that this particular paper really amplifies is that it also creates models for how people within a setting and perhaps beyond the setting might help one another. So it puts into motion some ethical and relational practices within a setting, which I think can support a kind of intentionality on the part of educators. And related to that is this focus on beginnings, right? That the beginnings may have particular ethical salience within a setting. How a setting begins, how a day begins, how an interaction begins, set into motion particular kinds of relational ethics as something that we want to think about. So I think that the last thing I'll say about implications is that this attention to how we see learning interactions, I think, has a kind of power to help us think about intentional design and interaction in new ways. Something that I've noticed myself as a parent, being much more intentional about how I engage in embodied forms of assistance. And I think that kind of praxis is at the heart of what research can do. And I think we're learning a lot right now about the significance of face-to-face interaction. And I think that the ways that families are also spending extended time together now can open up some possibilities for some of the relational implications of this work.
Thank you, Shirin. It's really nice talking with you about this paper. And for readers who are interested in this article, please scan the QR code and you can get the full paper on JLS website.